Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Edin Lopez Wash Processed Honduras from Kuma Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kuma, based out of Seattle, Washington. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel twice before. However, they are also a coffee roaster that I do have a long and extensive history with, as I've been drinking their coffee for a very long time, and I do have an opportunity to try their coffee pretty frequently, as there are a lot of coffee shops in the Seattle area that do serve Kuma's coffees. But one thing I've always found interesting about them is just how popular they are with you guys, as not only do our Kuma reviews perform pretty well, but you guys also have a lot of positive things to say about this coffee roaster. And since they are local, they are an easy coffee roaster to review while I might be waiting on a separate order. So I'm looking forward to revisiting Kuma, as this right here is day 25. And recipe we went with for this one deviated greatly from our standard recipe. This was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at about 201 degrees Fahrenheit, which roughly translates to 93 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this one, they list this as a medium light on the website for this coffee. However, Kuma's coffees have been on the slightly more developed side relative to a lot of other American coffee roasters. So this one, while it might not necessarily be a true medium, it's kind of pushing that boundary where you might say that it's a very, very light medium, or in other cases, a very developed light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 7, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and I could definitely feel a fair bit of the development to the cup, as there was an abundance of roastiness within the finish. In addition to that, there were some subtle floral aspects to the cup, as it was skewing in the classic robust Central American direction with a lot of just heavier, robust characteristics, most distinctly thinking of those chocolate and nutty components. So for the most part, it was an okay start, not necessarily my favorite. We continue on to day 8 and ran into the Chemex this time with a similar sentiment, as there was a fair bit of the smokiness on the forefront. In addition to that, there were some slight bright fruit aspects present within the cup, but the focus continued to remain on a lot of the more robust, heavier characteristics. Day 10, a bit more sweetness and also a bit of smokiness and bitterness, as it feels like the listed vanilla frosting is slightly more in this kind of bitter vanilla aspect. And that's typically the best way I can taste vanilla, is if it kind of skews in a floral sense, or if it skews most specifically in a kind of bitter floral sense. It's typically how I'm able to pick that out from the coffee. But in addition to that, there was a little bit more of this chocolate sweetness to the cup. So overall, it was a better day. I was seeing slight improvement from my first couple tries. Day 12, the cup is settling better, and I was seeing even more improvement, as there was still a fair bit of this smokiness, but it was making way for the listed vanilla being a little bit more present in a better sense, as it did continue to remain slightly bitter through the cup. However, it just had a little bit more vibrancy to it in general, and that contrasted the chocolate sweetness, kind of balancing this cup out in a certain sense. Can feel a lot of the robust characteristics in the finish as well, so the development is really playing a key role in this coffee. Day 14, ran it through the Chemex, and a lot of the roasty qualities came out at the forefront of this coffee on this day. This is the main reason I didn't like the Chemex as much, is because I felt so much more of those kind of roasty, smoky characteristics within this cup. A lot of the listed marzipan felt apt, as it was skewing in this heavy kind of smoky dark chocolate direction with a little bit of this kind of coffee bitterness and this slight zesty quality that's been somewhat persistent, and that's something that I can either align with the citric note that they have on here, or in addition to that, that kind of bitter vanilla aspect that I had mentioned earlier. Day 16 lowered the temperatures to kind of tone down the smoky qualities, and it did help a bit. So that's why we did settle on lower temperatures for this coffee, and that's something I kind of expected going into this one, because Kuma's coffees haven't necessarily been the lightest. Even the coffees that they do list on the lighter side of things aren't necessarily the lightest coffees in general. So this one right here being something that I identify as a more developed coffee, and something that traditionally is roasted a little bit longer, a Honduran coffee. I was kind of expecting to tone down the temperatures at some point, and it did help, as there's a chocolate component at the forefront once again with a slightly nutty quality, and the vanilla feels a slight bit more heightened too. So while toning down the smoky qualities, I was able to pick out a little bit more of some of the other things within the cup, as they weren't being overburdened by that really smoky quality. Day Day 19, getting a little bit more positive results with the lower temperatures and diluted ratio, as there's a slightly bitter but zesty vanilla-like quality to the cup yet again. The citric aspect is very tame and moderate in general, but it is present. I was able to pick up on the listed citric component they have on here. Plenty of rich chocolate. That was the most distinct and dominant thing, in addition to some more kind of smoky qualities to the cup. So I was seeing improvement. I was kind of happy with how this coffee was turning out towards the end. And on day 22, there hasn't been much of a change, as at this point it's been pretty consistent, better at warmer temperatures right after it's been brewed, because when I'm trying this coffee right after brewing it, I do enjoy it a lot more than when it does cool down, because when it cools down, I just pick up a little bit more of those kind of heightened smoky qualities to the cup. But there are some vanilla floral aspects within it in the slightly bitter sense with the dark chocolate on the back end, and still a fair bit of that slight citric aspect. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 4, so let's go through that real quick, and that is the finish at the level 4. So yes, it does have a fair bit of that kind of smoky finish to it, that chocolate finish to it, that's just more robust finish in general. So I don't necessarily have too much to say on that. That is the only level 4 that we have in the entirety of this tasting wheel. Then we have an abundance of level 3s. So we will start with the body level 3. That's actually kind of interesting to me, because going into this, I might have expected a lot more body, a lot more texture to this coffee. And part of the thing that might have impacted that was the fact that we did dilute the ratio on this one. This one was a lower concentration coffee in general, because that did seem to help with a lot of these smoky qualities to it. So having it there at that level 3, that might have been the reasoning why. But I think maybe if you did concentrate this one a little bit more, then you probably were going to get even more body from it. Cleanliness, level 3, yes, and I think when I was making this tasting wheel, I was really thinking about why I couldn't necessarily justify anything higher than the level 3, and that is, of course, going to be that smoky quality. I think at the end of the day, that's something that will take away from clarity in coffee, especially when it seems to be dominating the cup in general. So that being as abundant as it was, I couldn't help but leave that cleanliness there at that level 3 mark. Sweetness, level 3. Yes, it did have some nice sweetness to it. I think that's one of the underrated qualities that I haven't discussed as much throughout this review, as there was a fair bit of that kind of chocolate sweetness, and while I've mentioned it from time to time, it was definitely one of the better aspects of this coffee, a little bit more traditional in the sense of what you might expect from something like this. Acidity, level 3. That might be another benefit to some people, as this one isn't necessarily the brightest coffee. There were times I was getting a slight bit of brightness to it, which, truth be told, given the roast profile, I might not have expected as much of it going into it, but it definitely had a fair bit of that too, so that reached that level 3 mark. Florality, level 3. That's something I've been discussing ever since the first day, as there was this kind of soft, slight florality that was buried underneath a little bit more heavy characteristics within this one. I'm most distinctly thinking of that vanilla aspect to it. So I could see it there at that level 3. Saltiness, level 3. A fair bit of the nuttiness that was present within this one. Citrus, level 3, whatever fruit component I was able to pick up, it skewed the most in terms of that citric direction. And while they have a very specific sweeter citric component on here, it was a little bit more undefined for me specifically. So just kind of a more generic citrus on this one. Still one of the more prominent fruit aspects within this coffee. Chocolate, level 3. Even with as much as I've discussed it, I would not necessarily say that it was a specifically defined chocolate aspect within this one. It was a little bit on the sweeter side, but even then it just kind of maintained a more moderate status being there at that level 3 mark. Smokiness, level 3, yes, and I think I did a good job dialing this one down, because there are times, especially if you increase the temperatures, ran it to the Chemex, that's pretty much all you were getting from the cup. Start to finish was a very smoky quality to it in general. So that being there at that level 3, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think that that's just kind of the best way I could work with this coffee. And then the bitterness, level 3, it's a couple of things. It's most specifically the kind of floral bitterness that I was experiencing. Once again, that vanilla aspect within this one. But there was one more thing, because this coffee did have a little bit of that coffee bitterness, which you can experience from, well, just development in coffee in general. So that, I feel like, justified the level 3 in terms of the bitterness, but we have a couple of level 2s. I don't necessarily think that they're worth discussing. I think that this is a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one wasn't necessarily my favorite, but I do still want to say some positive things about Kuma because as somebody that tries their coffee a lot, there are some coffees I have from them that I think may be a little bit underrated. And this one going into it, I was actually picking up this bag of coffee to kind of work with something that I'm doing with the grinder currently. So it's something that won't even ever make the light of video, but this was mostly an experimental bag of coffee. And even while going through this review, I could tell that this one wasn't necessarily my preference to begin with. And it was just something that would have made for an interesting review given that I've been reviewing a lot more light coffees in general, and I kind of had an idea of what this coffee was going to be. The flavor profile on here doesn't even necessarily sound like my type of coffee to begin with, and these sort of Honduran coffees are also not my profile, so I do want to give Kuma the benefit of the doubts that I did pick one out that wasn't necessarily intended for me, so it wasn't necessarily my favorite, and there are some coffees from Kuma that I definitely enjoy better than this one. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, it's a little bit more in line with, I could even go further back in the traditional Central American drinker, because this coffee has a lot of those Central American characteristics while not necessarily focusing too heavily on some brightness to it. So of course we have the chocolate, we have the nutty, and then it does come out in a slightly more sweet manner too. And it does have a little bit more of the smoky qualities to it, which I know is an appealing prospect to some people. And while it might not necessarily be my profile for this coffee, I do know that some people do tend to gravitate towards this direction because it just does offer a little bit more of a comforting, traditional crowd pleaser sort of coffee overall. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Edin Lopez Wash Processed Honduras from Kuma Coffee. Thank you for watching.